Yeah, but and I would never root for the Blazers. They've been. I think I lost faith in them with the whole Greg Oden thing. Like, I don't know if you follow the Blazers at all, but they got when they played. When they played so much with Greg Oden, like, he basically spent like the entire career on the bench due to like knee surgery. I was like, nope. Jordan too. They could have had him back in the day. And the Bulls and stuff. Like that game now. I'm just not a fan of the Blazers. Levi's uncle passed away this weekend. I don't know if we're gonna go to the funeral or not, but if we do, I'll make sure to give you a heads up.
Okay, sure, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I know, what a rough weekend it was. It was crazy. I'm okay, but that's because I didn't really know the guys, but I think their family's taking it pretty hard.
What's it?
Because he's the last Wisnant. I think the only Wisnants now are my boyfriend and his cousin. So he was like the last of like, you know what I mean, like the uncles and the grandpa. And so he seems to be doing okay. I keep checking in with him. I'm like, are you okay? And I think he's not compartmentalizing it, but you know what I mean? Like he's a lot, it's easier for him to be like, yeah, okay. I'm like, all right, well, if we decide we're going to go, I was like, I'll give my teacher a heads up that we might go.
Okay.
So if we do, I'll just send you a message on Discord.
No problem. Okay, let's go ahead and get in the Zoom session. They've set it where there's a waiting room, so I had to admit you now.
Like you said, I just named something. I start playing. Big team live. That's what I take. Sports team doesn't have like. You can get more complicated. Football kicks the ball, baseball gets the ball. You can't hit them like a virtual get the ball. I guess good. I'm scared about this book. It's not good because it's dead weight to me. Yes. I don't understand that. The words I know. You said they're italicized? I didn't even notice. It barely. So you didn't even notice they were italicized. It's so vague. Right. Look how we have for italicized words. I went through and I started highlighting my special colors. Yes. Like I said, right now I've already got my book all marked up and everything. I'm like not even close to even. If you can see it, so they'll italicized. Exactly. They'll italicized a word. They won't say it is, but they might give like a inline definition. I'm just gonna fire the tailor. So look, here's like here is the example of the use of constructors italicized, and then it says supports the use of them, which allows blah blah blah. So they get an inline here, but it is like yeah. So you're not going to find like the other books. Yeah, you're not going to find it where it's like a that book. Is that the book that she's talking about? This is 5, but this is 4. That's one we use like that. And I'm starting with something. So just chapter 14. Chapter, it's chapter 11.
Oh, you have to find it.
Yeah. But, so the examples you have are very detailed.
Okay, I think I've found everybody.
Okay.
Isaac is at home, but he's on our Zoom session. A couple other people I have marked absent. Figuring out what's going on. All right. I told you last time to take a look at the chapter 14 information in the textbook. And a couple of things. Whenever you're looking at the book and they're showing you code samples, their source code is available at this GitHub location. So I'll leave that there on the Zoom session for you to get it. But it's A Press, our publisher name, and then Pro C# 7. And when you bring up this GitHub URL, you could go into a specific chapter if you wanted to, but that would be kind of awkward. So you can just download the entire library as a zip file. And so, of course, they've been using this kind of the car example throughout their object-oriented chapters. And if you've looked at the book, we've skipped around a little bit. In this chapter that we're looking at is pretty nuts and bolts and internals is what I would call it, like the internal aspects of how our applications are running. Okay, I've got this zip file downloaded, and of course, since I want to open these things in Visual Studio, I need to extract everything, so I'm gonna try to do that. Make sure I put it someplace where I would like to have it. And then I'll extract all that stuff. Kind of large. Visual Studio projects get really big, really fast, don't they? I gotta pass too long on something, so I'm just gonna skip it. That old era when you were trying to burn those games to CDs, huh? When you guys were kids, I remember. Well, that's unzipping. We're at week 4, so after this week we'll be a fourth of the way through. Woohoo! I thought that by now they would have told us all to stay home. So you guys are keeping everybody here, looking good. So make sure to keep your masks on. My husband and I had to do the investments this weekend, buy some more, buy some of the metal nose thingies, try to make sure that everything stays on. You guys have been doing a great job. I have some classes where things have been slipping a little. And then I did have a student go home the other day saying that they were gonna have to go get tested. So we do wanna make sure we're keeping our room as clean as possible. So along those lines, make sure you clean your work area before you leave. Remember, I'm not the cleaning Nazi nor the cleaning police. I'm not going to stop you and jump on you as you leave asking you. That's something that I need you to take responsibility for. Along the same line, stay home if you're sick. Even if you're just, super, super tired. Maybe it's more than being super tired unless you stayed up all night studying and stuff and you know that that's why you're super tired. So stay home if you're sick. You guys did a great job on that first project. It's very challenging. We lost some people. We didn't lose as many people I know as the hybrid class. I know Dr. Ford said last week that I think she lost 3 like during class. So that's always a bad day. But you guys don't do that. Hang in there, hang in here. Even if you're confused about things or a little bit weary of some things, everybody's going to help you. Remember to turn something in. If it's not perfect, it's all right, as long as it's something. We've got some stuff that's been turned in on Discord since our presentations last week, so make sure to watch those people's videos and give them some feedback on how they did on the project, because what we're here for is to learn about C#, not to bash each other, and make sure that everybody can do exactly the same thing. So we want to just learn it. We have a couple of guys that will be coming in. Let's see if I look at the calendar. Let me bring it up. I'm going to go to a month here. My calendar's kind of messy. I apologize. It's a little busy because I have classes on here. But on the 23rd, so a week from Wednesday, we're going to have a couple of people that work at Jack Henry right now as guest speakers. They graduated from OTC last year, year before, and then the other person graduated 3 or 4 years ago. So actually back when I first started teaching here. So they love doing the virtual guest speaking thing. They work together at Jack Henry. So they're really interesting to watch. So instead of just someone sitting up in the front of the room going blah, 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 and then this, they kind of bounce things off of each other, and they give you both perspectives of things. One of them got their job right away out of school, or actually wasn't even out of school yet, and has moved up very quickly. The other one was having a harder time finding a position, and the first guy helped him get his job at Jack Henry, and as things have worked out, that first guy has gotten promoted and is now the other guy's boss. And so things work out interestingly, and they'll talk a little bit about those dynamics and things along those lines. But these are the kind of questions I want you to ask them. You know, is one project going to make or break me? What should I do if I'm having trouble getting through a project? How should I approach my long-term goals instead of short-term? Why do I bring this up? Because you should have a new assignment that is asking you for a question for them. So let's make sure that's showing up in Canvas. There it is. I always keep ending up with it in its own window. Now, in my student view, I'm not seeing it yet, my lesson 4 stuff, because I have some things I need to complete from my lesson 3. So I'm going to find those items and mark them, or whatever it is that I need to do to them to let me move on. Even the outdated videos. See if I got them all. Now I should be able to see the lesson 4 stuff. And of course, I still have to get these assignments done in lesson 3, but the lesson 4 stuff should now be showing. And the assignment I'm talking about is the supposed to question for guest speakers. It's a discussion board so that way you guys can see what other people's questions are so that you don't post the same question. These guys are really, really open with you. Like I said, they're both former OTC students. They don't even mind you asking them flat out how much money they make. They might skip around it a little bit because they can't tell each other things like that, of course, because there's confidentiality, but they'll tell you a little bit about how much their lives have changed since they got their jobs at Jack Henry and all that kind of good stuff. So that's a week from Wednesday. They'll be on Zoom. So we have to decide whether we want to be on Zoom or in the classroom for that presentation. I don't know, you guys think about it. I'm kind of thinking that the classroom would be better because it'll kind of keep us all focused on and paying attention. I don't know, you guys might be better than me with the Zoom stuff, but if I'm talking on Zoom, I'm perfectly entertained. So funny. But when I'm watching somebody else, I do tend to get distracted pretty easily with other stuff going on. So let's say we come in, but if you have to be on Zoom, that'll be a more of an optional day, but do come to hear them as guest speakers, because this has been, over the past few semesters that these guys have been doing this for us, this has been a really, really important day for students, because people are finding out so many things that they didn't even know they needed to ask about getting ready for finding a job, and, you know, even what is Jack Henry and stuff like that. So Kelly and Matt will be really, really informative, and want you to be here for them. We also have 2 more assignments, but we're not going to worry about those right now because we're focused on the ones we have for today, because we're working with Chapter 14, our class libraries. I'm going to get this presentation downloaded. This is the one we looked at last time, and I did not have it posted to Canvas. So I do have it out here on Canvas now for you. Wasn't there before. We had left off. Talking about assemblies. Let me get to that spot. Slide 17 is where I have us having left off. Now, as we look at this chapter, like I said, we're talking about internals. So some of it might seem pretty highbrow, pretty high level, pretty hard to understand. And that's okay, it is. Because this is the kind of stuff that only certain developers are going to worry about and work with day in, day out. Some of these utilities are things that we might not ever have to work with at all, or we might work with constantly. So last time we were talking about how these assemblies, these shared class modules, these shared data types can be passed around to other companies, other organizations. Like Walmart can give me a DLL that helps me do EDI interactions with them. Well, how am I going to find out about that thing? And what am I going to be able to use in it? And all of those things are kind of the utilities that they're showing us through the chapter. How do I investigate what's inside of a DLL that I might not have created? Before we get to that though, talking about private assemblies versus shared assemblies. First is private assemblies. A private assembly is simply a DLL, and an assembly, let's back up, an assembly could be considered an executable type file. So a .exe or a .dll, right? That's what they're focusing on in our chapter, the .exe and the .dll type files. So when we're talking about that being an assembly, that just means that it's been compiled down to that type of code that can be interpreted by the C# runtime. So it's an assembly level module. It's already been assembled by the compiler. Now, when we're looking at these private assemblies, we're talking about a DLL that is in the same project folder as my project, or a DLL that's in the same solution folder as my project. So some sort of DLL that I can get to easily. It's shared within my package. So when I'm looking at this kind of DLL and I'm in the same folder or something like that, the same location, there are some certain characteristics about this assembly that I need to be concerned with. First of all, here's my project folder over here. I'm working with an application called My App, and inside my App project folder, I have the executable that's been generated when I built my project. Right? So I could go find that executable in any of my project folders by looking at that bin debug folder, right? And I could go find that executable. So whenever I'm looking at that, that's basically my friendly name, right? C# car client. That would be my friendly name. So that name is just the name of that executable file. If I were to look at the Visual Studio project, I could see that I could find a configuration.cs file or configuration file. I don't know if it's a .cs. I think it's a .xml. I'm saying the wrong thing. And here's an example of a configuration file like that. We're saying that for this configuration, you should look at the My Libraries folder. So if we look at that, we can see that information. So that XML in element right there that says what that path is influencing the probing process. What are they saying there? They're saying that this XML file is going to be read, and the system is going to use the information in the XML file to find the assembly to run. It's going to probe through all the different folder locations to find that assembly. So that probing process is the system trying to locate it. Now, some things about the name of that assembly and the name of that module. The private assemblies really have some specific information associated with their name besides just the name or identity. They could have the version associated with them. And that makes sense because if I have version 1.0.0.0 of my project versus version 2.0, I want to be able to specify which version of the DLL another project is using, right? So that version could be important. But the runtime system doesn't really worry about that. It's just trying to find that friendly name. So it's going to search through the library, and when it finds it, it's going to bind it to the runtime and use it. That's called late binding. Now, that doesn't seem super important, but it is. Because if I have 57 DLLs that are all combined together into this application that all of my users use, and I change one of those DLLs, do I want to have to recompile the whole thing to create a new executable? Right, I don't. I want that one changed one to automatically be binded in the next time I run. I want link binding. I want it to get the newest version of each of those 57 DLLs every time it runs, instead of me having to recompile. Does that make sense? When we're working with older programming languages, a lot of times we don't have that late binding capability, and any change to anything will require a recompile of everything, which can be a massive undertaking. So that late binding means that as I run, the system's going to find all those pieces that are needed. Another way of referring to that would be dynamic invocation of type members. When the runtime system encounters something that I specify, I want to create a new car, I've got to go find that type car. To find it, I need to figure out what DLL it's in, what library that DLL is in, go find it and load it. That dynamic invocation. So basically the same thing as late binding, just from a different point of view. Late binding is talking about how that DLL library gets loaded. Dynamic invocation is talking about how my car type gets loaded within that DLL. Okay, so basically from all of that, what you're going to need to remember, a few things. Private assemblies are basically in the same project folder. It's my project, right? I have to have a .config XML file in my project folder to be able to find them. The process of finding them is called probing. The fact that I can find them when the project is executing is called late binding. So how is that different than a shared assembly? Well, a shared assembly is one that is not within my project folder. So an example might be like the system library or system.forms or something like that that we use. We don't have to have that specific DLL loaded up into our project library. Visual Studio will take care of that for us. Whenever we're working with a shared assembly, it's going to be found in the Global Assembly Cache, the GAC. So this squirrel here is loading up his cache, his cache of nuts, because remember, a cache is something that is stored away in a convenient location that is easily accessible. So this squirrel hopefully will be able to find this convenient location when he's looking for it, and it will be easily accessible. And that's what we want to do with shared assemblies. We want them to be loaded to this cache area so that we can find them quickly and they can be easy to access. We know exactly where to look. So where do we look? Well, if we're running .NET before 4.0, we're going to look in the Windows folder, and there should be a directory named assembly. We could go look. Let's check. If I look at my Windows folder, and they said it was named assembly. There it is. Ah, and there's my global assembly cache. Sure enough. So I've got that. Now, after .NET 4.0 and above, which is where we would be, because we're using a newer version, the global assembly cache is going to be saved in a specific folder within the Windows folder, Microsoft.NET assembly /GAC _. So let's see, Windows, Microsoft. And then we see our global assembly cache. So if we go through the process that they give us in the textbook to install something into our global assembly cache, we should be able to come to this location and find it. We should be able to see that it got put there. So if we're working with an older version of .NET, then we're going to be looking at this folder that's in the assembly folder. That's called the historic global assembly cache. Either way, we've got this cache file out there. We want to get our DLL put into this cache file. In order to do that, we have to create what's called a strong name. And a strong name is a friendly name for our DLL, but it's going to be unique. So it can't just be unique for us, right? It's got to be unique, like unique across the universe. So that's what we're going to do, is put some information together to guarantee that it's absolutely unique. So our strong name is going to start out with the friendly name of our assembly, that name we saw earlier. The version number is going to be added to it. Then the public key value. The public key value is an encryption type key that's generated based on the contents of the DLL. So they say in our text, if you change one little item in one string, that's going to generate a new public key value. So our public key is going to be unique for that code, for that DLL. Now, on top of that, or associated with that, we're also going to add in the culture. And we're used to that a little bit. I think it's kind of neat that we had to use that culture stuff in REPL because that gives us that little bit of exposure. We know that culture is a thing that Visual Studio supports for us. And finally, the digital signature. And each of those are explained a lot more in our textbook. But if we look at the way that strong name is going to, in effect, be generated, here we've got it. We have our car library DLL. We have the manifest, it's a public key, all the metadata about our different types that are contained within the CLL. We have a car type, and what's the other one, a race car, and some of those different types. The common language instructions for us and the digital signature, all of that information is working together to make that strong name. Now, we saw in the textbook the SN utility. If you messed with that, good job. The SN utility helps generate that strong name and the required SNK strong name key file for us. But that's before 2003. So that's something that we probably wouldn't have to use very often. We're generally going to use Visual Studio to generate that strong name. And we're going to do it looking at our project properties under the signing information. We should be able to create that strong name key. Tell me about that. Did anybody try it? I know RJ did because he mentioned it. Was it a mess? Was it pretty easy to do?
Yeah, there was, I wouldn't say it was easy to do.
No.
There was a lot of hoops that I don't mean to beat a dead horse. The book kind of left out a few hoops that I had to jump through.
Uh-huh.
I Google searched why is this not working kind of things.
Good.
And then I finally, I think getting to the SNK, I had a weird error that I just kind of followed along with the rest of the book. I wasn't able to go along with it after.
Uh-huh. So it just kind of left you hanging.
Yeah, it was kind of an unresolved thing that I ran into.
And one thing that RJ mentioned that I thought was really, really smart is that maybe not with this utility, but one of the other ones that our textbook mentioned, he got us that older PDF document that we refer to in C#1, and you could search online for some of these utilities too. And that older document explained it better because it is an older utility. And our textbook is kind of bringing these up to let you know that they're out there and kind of giving you an idea of how to run them. But sometimes it does leave us hanging a little bit, and we might have to refer to older documentation. So I know if you looked at my house, you'd be surprised at some of the old textbooks that I have. Why do I have a DOS 6.0 textbook? Well, because sometimes I need to understand command prompt stuff that I haven't done in 10 or 15 years, and I can pull out that old DOS 6.0 book and I can figure it out. And that's what happens on Google when we search for things. So I just searched for some of it that was missing online. But I think that any sort of older reference manual that you have to refer to sometimes is important. So we would do this strong name generation using Visual Studio.
I think actually it was at this point that I realized that you have to be signed into the program as an administrator, not just into your computer as an administrator. I think that was the big loop there.
The big thing. A lot of these utilities that they mention are that way. Okay, so then I'm going to back up here. Once we've got this shared DLL, we can consume it or use it as our resources. And they show that we can attach to it very quickly and easily when we have it in that cache area. But that's something that I'm missing a piece or two there. That's my fault for not having my external. The important thing about these shared assemblies is these are very closely controlled and monitored. So if you work at Walmart and you're one of the developers that's responsible for this Walmart.dll shared assembly that gets sent out to the rest of the world, you can bet you don't update that thing just on a whim, right? So we have all sorts of testing that has to occur, all sorts of quality control that has to occur before a new version of that DLL is going to be issued. So whenever we are updating something in that global assembly cache, they mention in our book that's usually a process of moving things to production. So in the case of Walmart, whatever procedures they have to go through, they're finally get to the final point in time where they're ready to move that new one out. There's going to be procedures followed, and there's going to be like a special person that has ultimate security levels that's going to be able to actually make that happen and put it into that global assembly cache that can be accessible by their customers and partners. So production, where things are accessible to other users, and our global assembly cache are going to be really tightly controlled and really, really secured in our company. So in our assignment, we're going to create a private assembly. So whenever you're looking at your assignment here, we want to create a DLL and use it in our project, but we don't need to put it into the global assembly cache or any of those kinds of things to make it into a true shared assembly. That would be really hard for us to communicate back and forth that it had worked, and we don't have those kind of procedures in place to check those things into production and all of that it would require. So for your assignment, just a private DLL that's going to be part of your solution or several solutions, depending on how you want to organize your project. It's up to you for your multiple projects. And then we're going to share this. So the first thing that we need is a base class, and this is supposed to hold information about sporting teams. So you could call this class team or sport, all sorts of different things that you could call it. Whenever we look at thinking about a team, we need to come up with, let's see, characteristics, so data elements for our team, and some methods. So we don't have any specifics about how many we have to have, but we want to have enough to actually work with. So they suggest the coach's name and the name of the sport. So that sounds good. Coach, name, sport, name. So this is not going to be like absolutely perfect. What other kinds of things would we need to keep track of in our base class that has to do with teams at our school?
School name.
Sorry, what?
School name.
School name? Is that going to change? Is that part of our team? It could be. I mean, if we were running, if our information was taking care of multiple schools, so we might have another class off somewhere that had more information about the school, but we don't need to do that for our project, but we could still have that school
Team
name.
color.
Team color, that's a good one.
What about like positions? I know we haven't picked like an actual sport we're doing, but each sport has like positions that are pretty important to the players. Right?
That'd be a sport type.
Would that?
Sport type, we don't want, because we're going to use subclasses to define what type of sport it is. So that's thinking right, but we're going to implement that using our subclasses. Huh?
Player number.
Player number, number of players? Is that what are we talking about the same thing? Number of players? Because remember, this has to do with the whole team, not an individual player. So the whole team, how many players do we have? Are there other things that we need to know about any kind of team?
Boys or girls, if it's like wrestling or basketball, you know how there's girl team, boy team.
Okay. What do you call that?
Mixed co-ed.
Okay. I'll let you guys come up with a code system for that.
Varsity, junior varsity teams.
All sorts of things, good thinking. Okay, so as we're looking at our team then, we're gonna need constructors. So when I look at what methods I'm gonna need to create, I'm gonna need to create some constructor methods for my team. And RJ asked, how many constructors do we need? That's gonna be up to you. I will wanna see, you know, a base specification in our extended class. So we want enough constructors that we can do that. All right, so we're gonna need our team constructor. We're gonna need to override the toString method. It says in your specifications. And then it says we have to have at least one abstract method that has to be implemented by all derived classes. So we could have something that's like, we don't have any data elements that are the motto, or is that what you call it, the motto, the spirit song, whatever. So we could have something like get motto. And then this would be our abstract that every sport that extends our team's base has to implement. And then we also need one virtual method that they can redefine if they want. For me, the virtual method, right away, I start thinking about this mixed or co-ed, saying we could have some sort of method that returns if it's mixed or not, I guess. Co-ed status. We'll say that that would be our virtual method. So then whenever we extend our team class, let's say we have one sport, how about soccer? And then one that I thought that was really interesting that I've seen some people do. I'm anti-segregation, but I think doing cheerleading is a good stretch of our brains to think about what kinds of things that we would have for cheerleading that we wouldn't need to keep track of for other sports. Because that's why we do base classes with extended classes. What are the things now that we would need to keep track of for soccer that we don't need to worry about for other sports? What kind of things would we need to keep track of for cheerleading that we wouldn't need to think of for other sports? Let's do one and we'll think about it as we're working. So let's open Visual Studio and create an application here. We haven't had much chance to do stuff together, so we will. I want to create a new project. Now, if you want to go ahead and make sure that you're connected to TFS before you create your new project, or I'm just going to connect to it after we get our project created. Now, we're creating a class library here. So I'm going to choose class library and click next. So let's see, I have some samples we could use and I can pull from, but it would kind of be nice if we came up with our own stuff that we would like to keep track of in our class library. So what would you like? We could do, one thing that we do all over the place is students. So I have a lot of examples where we could do a base class of students and we could extend that with college students and high school students or something like that. We could do like maybe devices, where we say that we're a shop that repairs devices, and we could have an extension from our device class of phones and maybe one of tablets. We could do something like that as a repair shop. We could do a restaurant. So we have menu items, and then we can have different categories of menu items like entrees and desserts and things like that. What seems really interesting to you guys today?
Hospital.
Hospital.
I agree.
Okay, so what are we gonna do? Let me write it down. So hospital. What about it? What are we thinking we need to keep track of?
Patients, number of patients.
Number of beds.
Well, I think like you guys did over here, first we should have their name. Should we have location? Maybe
You mean,
have
like
it,
location within the hospital, like ER or,
or do you want the location of the actual hospital?
oh, gotcha.
In Springfield and Branson,
You can have active staff.
active staff.
President of the hospital.
Oh, that's a good one. President. We've been seeing it over and over, number of ICU beds. Anything else? Lots of other things, of course.
Severity of the cases, maybe?
Do what?
Severity of the patients, maybe? No, you probably call it.
That's gonna be a change, like, whenever we're designing our system, remember we wanna make sure that we're keeping data where it belongs, and that would be changing patient information. So that really wouldn't have anything to do with the hospital itself. If we did keep that, we would have a lot of updating to do all of the time.
Just, I know this is kind of touchy, but what about like, if we wanted to keep track of cases of like COVID patients they had in the hospital, is that something we could do as well?
We could, but then again, we wouldn't, that would be more cases
Right, okay.
instead of the whole hospital overall.
Right,
So if we wanted to do that, we could do that, but we'd have to start with our base class being more of a patient
okay.
than a hospital.
List
Right.
of each department in the hospital.
A doctor what?
A doctor name.
Doctor name? Again, that wouldn't go in our main hospital class, because we would have a doctor class for all of our doctors.
List of hospital departments.
We could have departments. And you guys are doing such a great job, and you're thinking of other entities that are involved in our hospital. We're gonna focus just on the hospital itself, not pieces of the hospital or patients in the hospital, but things that have to do with the total overall hospital building itself. So notice how that's different than if we wanted to make a class about departments. Then we could have each individual hospital department's information. And we could do that. We could add another class into our system to keep track of that. But if we're thinking about what logically belongs with just the hospital entity itself, we want those overall things. So we could have like number of parking spaces.
Okay, so that's what I was thinking, so like ramps and fire escapes and,
How many floors it has.
right.
Right. Exactly. So all of those kinds of things.
Okay.
So then, if I was looking at a specific hospital, what kinds of extensions would I have? This is where things could get a little rough with us on this example. Could I have like ER hospitals? I think we should do patients. I think you guys are better off doing patients instead of hospitals.
Okay.
Because then we can say, for a given patient, we want to know their name. We could have their admit date, the location they got admitted. Let's do like,
diagnosis.
number, your doctor.
Severity.
Primary doctor. Good, all those kinds of things. Okay, so keep thinking about those because those are really good data elements. Now, when we have a base patient, how could we extend that? We could say that we have a maternity patient. Now, do we need to know different things about this patient? Yes. Their due date. What else? Do we know what the birth?
Live birth or C-section.
Let's just make it C-section. And so other things like that that would have to do with just a patient that's in for a maternity reason would go into our maternity patient class. And then, of course, we're going to have the COVID patient. And then what are they going to have that's different?
The status if they're, like if they have it or not.
Okay, so like positive or negative.
Thank you, that's what I was, thank you.
And so we could go with the date they were tested,
Right.
previous activity.
But you have to keep track
Um,
of when they've been, like the last like 2 weeks or something.
Contact.
Yeah, we could have a big text box or something where we would keep information like that, like big notes. There was something else I was thinking about though that we would have. Do I?
Critical status.
Critical status. Are they a redo? What's that word where they're reinfected?
Oh, they're like.
So we could, again, keep going on and on. And I think that one for you guys to think about that really is related to this, Dr. Ford had posted in one of the job position postings, or maybe it was one of the ones that has to do with the coding contest. You guys will have to find it and see what you can remember. But somebody is looking for people to help with contact tracing, like software development. People
Oh,
for
yeah,
contact tracing.
that's expired now, but
Is
yeah,
it expired?
she did post a job about helping something similar to
Something
that.
to do with that?
Yeah.
But I think that it's a really interesting design topic for you to think about just in your head. What would be necessary for contact tracing? You know, because really, if you're thinking about it from the cell phone data standpoint, really all you're going to have is kind of that geotag, right? In a date and time as to where this person was and when they were there. And then you're going to be comparing that to other geotags with dates and times. So there isn't really a lot of data to do that contact tracing. And if you've seen some of the maps they've illuminated where they've shown the movement of people, have you seen the one from Vegas, from Las Vegas? There's if you search, if you Google it, Las Vegas cell phone data tracking movement or something like that, it's all in gold, so you'll know which one it is. But if you look at it, you can see that from Vegas, there's a lot of really consistent movement that people have to other areas where there's a lot of casinos and things like that, surprisingly enough. And then, of course, they've got that tracking map that shows people that went to Sturgis, like all the different places that they came from. So you can see in looking at that map, you know, that a lot of people came, you know, went up through Kansas City, like from our area up to Sturgis and stuff. So those contact tracing maps are very interesting because they show that that data is being collected and it's out there, but you have to figure out how to use it and how to implement it. So just in that same way, we don't want to carry any data unless it's absolutely correct and belongs where we've put it. Does that make sense? Because if we were contact tracing, if we tried to keep anything else other than a geotag and that date and time, we just corrupted that data, right? Because what else are we going to keep track of? The restaurant name? We don't know. That's just a geotag. There is a restaurant near that location. Were they there? Well, we don't know because all we know is that they were tagged at that location. So in that same way, we want to keep our data to only the absolute data that we have to have, because if we start putting other things in, then we start making it a little bit less reliable, a little bit less usable, because it's not as focused as we want it on that particular topic. Okay, so let's create our project. We're going to call this thing Patient Tracker. And it started out with my class1.cs file. And in our textbook, they say, delete that. Well, we don't have to delete it. We can rename it. It'll be okay either way. Let's rename it. I'm going to use Solution Explorer. And remember, that's the best way to rename it. So I'm going to choose rename. And I'm going to make sure the .cs stays intact. And this class is going to be our patient class. That's our first one. Now in class 1, when we created our DLL library, notice that they actually added the keyword public to our class header. When we created class files before, that access mode is usually left off. Remember, it's going to default to private, so we need to be aware this one is public. We don't want to be able to actually create any instances of a patient because a patient in and of itself doesn't give us enough information. We only want to create instances of particular types of patients, like maternity patients or COVID patients. So we're going to mark this class as abstract. And then that means that I cannot create an instance of it. Whenever we're creating a class, we can use some Visual Studio tools to help. I'm going to right-click on my patient.cs file. And I want to find that class diagram thing. It's being mean. So what I'm going to do is on my project, I'm going to add a new item. And what I want is a class diagram. And I'm going to leave it named class diagram 1.cd. That's fine. It says that looking at this blank class designer here, it says that I can visualize existing types by dragging items from Solution Explorer onto this piece of paper. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to drag my patient onto this class diagram, and it's empty. My class doesn't have any information. So I'm going to look down here at the bottom of the screen. Does everybody have this class details area down here? Showing up. This makes it really fast, quick and easy for us to create things in our class. So I'm going to start with fields. And we decided that we wanted a name. Now, if I press tab, I'm going to move over to the type column. And I want this to be a string. I can type right. Now, as far as my modifier, leaving it private is what I want. That's good. And I'm going to add another field. The next one that we said we had is admit date. Because these are going to be our private data fields, I'm starting them with a lowercase character. I can say that this is a date time. Next, my location. It's a string. And let's just do our primary doctor. I'll use primary physician, even though it's harder to spell. And I'm going to leave our diagnosis out for a couple of reasons, mostly because we might actually want that to be on our extended class, even though it's something we would have for all patients. So there's questions about that placement. And also because I don't want our classes to be too big as we're working here. I don't want us to have too much data, too many data elements, or it will make it hard for us to work with it. Okay, so that gives me all of my private fields. I could go look at my patient class now, and I could see that those fields have been added. I've got something wrong there. I didn't think that was the right way to spell that data type. I'll fix it there, and it should be fixed in my class diagram. Yeah, there it is. Okay, and then what I could do next is add all my properties. So I'm going to have name as a string. I'm going to use all my uppercase names. Admit date is a date time. Location, oops, with the uppercase L. And then primary physician. Now, if I look at my patient code, I should see my getters and setters that have been somewhat created. I still might have to do a little work on those, but it's put placeholders in for all of them using that class details screen. Now, the last thing I could do then on my class details screen is I could define my methods. I know that I want a toString method. And remember, if we don't say that it is an uppercase string data type, it won't override correctly. Well, let me put in the override. So we might have to fix that a little bit too. And we know we're going to want some constructors that we can put those in manually. All right. So now, by using our class diagram, our cute picture of our patient class, we've been able to kind of build some of that code behind the scenes as we go. Some people like it, some people hate it. But when we need to create classes really quickly, it's a good way to get started. So let's go to our patient then and fix everything up. I'm going to start out with some header documentation. I'm going to use the 3 slashes to throw in that summary XML. Now I'm going to say this abstract class defines a base patient. And then, of course, we like to use our region statements as documentation and to separate out our code. So I'll use that # region and say that our private data elements are right there. And then I'll go to where they end and put in that end region statement. And we could say end private data elements, or I know some of you have really nice methodologies of putting some dashes and things like that in there to help. Love it, love it. And you see just from this list of data elements you guys came up with for teams, you could go on for pages, right? So that region statement could be a lot more meaningful in that big one than what we have. All right, so then let's do another # region for our public auto properties. And looking at our getters and setters, we have so many different formats we can use for those. And what they put in was something that's a little bit different maybe than what we should use, because we are using the separate names, lowercase names for our data elements and uppercase names for our properties. So I'm going to say my getter should return name. What's mad at me? How about just name? Shortcut. And then for our setters, we want to set name equal to what is that data they sent? Value. So we'll need to do that for each of ours. For our getter then, for our date, we'll get the lowercase data. And for our setter, we'll set that private data field equal to the value that was passed. This is an area too that you might ask our guest speakers about. Some companies require every one of these auto access or properties to have separate comments, and some companies don't, but I know a lot of companies do. Okay, so our admit date then should be done. Let's go down to location. If somebody uses our location getter, we want to get that lowercase location data field for them. And if they use the setter, we want to set that lowercase location field equal to the value they pass. And finally, for our primary position, we'll do the same thing. So now our class should be pretty well set for our private data fields and our public properties. So let's end that region. And then my toString, the override keyword didn't come across. So I need to fix that. I'm going to put in override. I should clean it up a little bit. Now, the default code that was generated for that method is not code that we want to use. It's going to throw some error. We would rather not throw an error. So let's fix it right now. Let's say that we would return, let's build a string. Let's be nice. String return string equals nothing to start. And then we'll add to it I want to use that interpolated string. So I'll put my $sign there and say that I want to use our patient name. Let's go to a new line. And then let's add a little bit more. We have our patient name. Let's output their admit date also. And with our admit date, we may end up needing to do some formatting, right? Because we might end up with milliseconds and things there. And then finally, we can fix that error by putting our return statement in and returning our string that we've built with our patient string information in it. Now to continue our documentation, let's put a $region before that method. And we'll say that these are our instance methods. And then we'll end that region. And then remember, you can collapse all those regions down. If you've got yourself where everything is hidden from you, which you guys do to me, if you use your edit menu, you can go to outlining and toggle all outlining. Will open everything back up, expand it out for you. So this looks good. We need a couple more things, some constructors. So I'm going to add a new region for that. The constructors. And I'll go ahead and put my end region. Okay, so for our constructors, let's do first of all our default no arg constructor. It's going to be public. So if we leave our default no arg constructor like this, where we don't have any sort of code, then we're going to end up with patients, theoretically, that have absolutely no data, right? So we're going to come back and take care of this. But for right now, this is our default no arg constructor. Let's put a comment on it. So the next patient constructor that I'd like to have is, I think that we should have a constructor that has the name and admit date. What do you think? That's kind of like minimum information for us, isn't it, to create a patient? Otherwise, we're sort of just making things up. So let's say we're going to have a string for the name, and we're going to have a date time for the admit date. So with that data, we're able to set our name data item and our admit date. So if we have a patient like that, we should probably set up some defaults for all of the other things, right? So let's say our location equals unknown. Diagnosis. Oh, we didn't do that. Primary physician. And at this point, we'll say that it's the on-call doctor because we had somebody just come in. Now we could make another constructor that had all of our data items. Let's do that. In this constructor, we'll take the name, the admit date, a string for our location, and a string for our primary physician. Then we would be able to set up all of our data items properly. Oops, got a comma there. That's why it didn't like it better. Now, last time, remember we turned off that terrible utility thing that was messing up our code. And we downloaded the tool to do the curly braces colorized. So if you weren't here and you need info on that, let me know and we'll find it after class because it helped a lot to get rid of some of the help there. Okay, so now we have multiple constructors. We have a comment for our default no-arg constructor. Let's put a comment for this constructor will populate the name and date. And then for our other one, this constructor will require all data elements. Now, if I switch back to my class diagram, I should see a little bit more stuff on there. Yep, there's my methods. So I see my constructors showing me that I have one patient, that's my default no-arg constructor, and then I have two overloads. Our overloads are our different constructor parameter sets, and then our two-string method. Our properties are all showing up real good, and our fields are showing up real good. So it looks great. Everybody's okay with it? Got stuff?
I'm getting a weird squiggly red thing in my public string name. It doesn't like my get return. And then when I click on my class diagram, my page.
Aaron sees it.
There we go.
Woohoo!
You saw it.
Yay!
Thank you.
Okay, so that our patient class looks pretty good there. And of course we're going to need to add some more methods because we don't have an abstract method or a virtual method, and we need those for our assignment. So let's add them. I'm going to put those before the two-string, but after our region statement for our instance methods. So the first one would be a public abstract. And then what kind of method would we have that we would require? Maybe like intake info, where we fill in some notes or something about the patient, because we were saying we're probably going to need some notes. I bet we're going to need notes for all of them. And that would be something that we would have for most of our different types of patients. So let's say we're going to require an abstract, or we're going to require a method that returns a string, and we want this to be in any class that extends our patient class, and we'll call it intake notes. Now, notice how that abstract definition works. I'm going to put a comment above it that is not going to be one of those 3/, but a 2/ comment for our info. So abstract method has no body. So it's a method header with that keyword abstract added in, and we have a place for our parameters. We could have parameters that we pass, but it has no body. Now, when we extend this class, every class that we extend is going to require this intake notes method to be created, and it's going to have to return a string. And if we have parameters in there, it would have to use those exact parameters. So every class that extends this class will have to have this abstract method exactly as coded, the way our header is right there. All right, and then what about a virtual method? And remember, a virtual method is one that can be overridden. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. So if we have a public virtual method, let's say this string is going to be, how about initial cost, and we'll say then that doesn't need to be a string. Let's make it be a double or a decimal, whichever you like. And let's return that our initial cost by default will be what? Probably about like that. Okay, it's taking it without the data type identifier. Okay, so we would like to override that in our extended classes because hopefully it won't be $1 million to have a baby, but it could be, I don't know. West Aaron. Close to $1 million. All right, so when we're creating these classes, we're just going to load up these methods with some sort of test data so that we can be sure it's working. So I just have some return value that will be noticeable that that million was returned from our base class. So now if we override that method in our extended classes, we can just return a different value, and then we'll be sure that our override worked. Makes sense? Because here we're just trying to be able to test this class because we don't have anything else that we can do with it other than test it. Perfect, so let's save it. I'm going to do a save all. Make sure everything's all saved. So my patient here is something that's going to be out and available to others. Let's build a DLL for it. In my build menu, notice how if you use your play button, you don't really have a play button because of this being one of those class library type projects. It's not really giving us the same kind of options as we're used to. And since it's just a DLL library, we can build our DLL. And there's a couple of different ways we can do it. We can build the entire solution, or we can just build our patient tracker project. Notice some of these other options here. Sometimes we have seen it in class where people had a hard time getting a new DLL generated, and you can use this clean option to kind of force Visual Studio to clean up all of the pieces of your last build, and then that way when you rebuild again, it will work properly. So the way it should be, you should build once, rebuild after that. but it kind of does the same thing either way, because Visual Studio over the years has been like, yeah, we can handle it. Okay, so I'm going to try to build it. Not much there. I see build succeeded down at the bottom. That's a good sign. Now I want to go look at my folder for my project and see if my DLL is there. So, you know, I could change this view up here to that folder view, but I just hate that. So instead, I'm going to right click on my solution and I'm going to open my folder in File Explorer. So here's my project folder, my patient tracker project. And inside my patient tracker project, my bind folder is my binaries or my executables. So if I double click on that, I see I have a debug folder. I'm just going to keep drilling down. And finally, I see my patient tracker.dll. Yay. So let's use it. So a couple of ways we could do this. We have decisions to make about how much stress do we want to give ourselves. First of all, I could just create another class file right in our patient tracker class, right? And they would be right within the same project folder. I wouldn't even need that public keyword on my classes because they're within that same project folder. But that doesn't really give us the true feeling of how this would work in the real world, right? Because we probably wouldn't have them in the same project. So in our solution, we could just add an additional project for our maternity patient. That would be a good way. Then they're sort of separated. The third option we have is that we could close this solution completely and create a whole new solution for each of our different types of patients. And that would be the most real world solution because that's probably what would happen if we were out working somewhere. But that's also going to give us the most trouble. So we're going to go the in-between approach, and we're going to create multiple projects within this solution. So remember that we have all of these different ways we could architect this, and that would change how we found our DLL file. So let's create a new project. In my solution, I'm going to add a whole new project. Now this project, again, is going to be a class library because it's just going to be our extended classes. So let's do our COVID patient first because our maternity patient is almost exactly the same and we don't have near as much data for it. So we'll start with our COVID one. So I'll say this is going to be our COVID patient. And again, I'm going to roll up my patient tracker project so that it's kind of out of the way. And I'm going to rename this class1.cs file that Visual Studio created for me. And when I rename it, I'm going to make it be named COVID patient. Now our COVID patient is going to inherit from our patient. And as I start typing, IntelliSense apparently doesn't seem to know what a patient is. And that makes sense because I need to add in some sort of reference to this DLL. So let's try it. In our COVID patient project, you can see that we have dependencies, but that's about all. We need to add a little bit more. So I'm going to right click again on my project. I'm going to add, and I want to add a project reference because I need this project to reference that other project. And whenever the reference manager comes up, this window doesn't look that complicated, but actually it is. We have 3 areas here. First of all, where do you want me to go look for assemblies? In the middle, assemblies that have been found. And then over here, just information about that assembly. So right now, when it opened up, it went straight into our solution, and it said, in your solution, I find this DLL that you probably are wanting to add a reference to. And it's absolutely right, that's the one we want.
I'm not finding that in my solution folder.
You guys are so good. Thank you. Now, if I didn't find it, I might need to browse, and go find that project folder where my project actually is and find that DLL. So it'd be super easy to go find it if it didn't show up here. But since we're in the same solution, it's showing up. So I'll put a check in this box to actually create that reference. Now, when I do that and click OK, we should see that reference appear in our project. It's under our dependencies. Now we see our patient tracker project showing up in there. So we know that we add that dependency to it. Now, one of the things that the chapter showed you how to use, that decompiler IL tool. We have another tool in Visual Studio that you can use called the Object Browser. Let's take a look at it. See if I can figure out how. View. There it is. Object Browser. It's the second set, the bottom of the second set. Now, when I look at the Object Browser, it shows me all of the different objects that are part of my project. And I see my COVID patient DLL in that Object Browser. And if I expand it, I can get to the class itself, and I can find our patient object. Oops, I'm looking at the wrong one. I should be looking at the patient tracker. Our patient tracker is the one that we have the reference to. And if I pull it in, I see that I have a toString and some different things in that patient object. If you click on the object itself where it says patient with that object icon, you'll see the information about our actual class. So you see our methods, our properties, and our data. Does everybody see that? Are you finding the Object Browser okay? So notice how that gives you a lot of that same information is that command line tool that they were showing you. And I did some comparisons, and there are certain things that the Object Browser won't show you that that tool will, but that tool is kind of an obsolete or an older thing. So a lot of different ways for us to look at information. But this is where you would need to go. You get that DLL from Walmart, and you're not sure what it contains. Because when you look at this object, then in the Object Browser, you can see the methods that it contains and different things. And of course, if they've tried to hide it from you, then it might be more difficult. All right, so now we've got that reference created in our new project to our old project. So I should be able to add that dependency to say that this COVID patient inherits from my patient. Now we can say patient tracker dot patient, or we could put a using in, right? So let's try using patient tracker, and then I should be able to get rid of that fully qualified name. But I've got an error. Do you have an error? What's your error? What's it say?
That's given the abstract.
Because we don't have our abstract method defined yet. And it says, oh, you can't inherit from this patient unless you create that method. Plus, I shouldn't have that semicolon there. Duh. Okay, so our new class will be in error until we override or implement that abstract class. So we could do that. Now what's it griping about? I put that method in, still complaining about it. Am I missing something?
It needs to be override.
Has to have that, I have to have that override keyword. Finally, everything's happy then. Okay, and in our class, we have a couple of things that we wanted to keep track of that were separate data items from our base class. Now, we're already going to have access to all of these data items because we're basically taking this patient class and extending it, adding more to it. So let's say we're going to have our critical status, or let's see, our positive or negative. I'll say private, and this will be a Boolean. And then let's do our date tested. And our notes for now. Now, the last time, I don't have my region statements. Public auto accessor properties. Okay. So I'm going to create some getters and setters. And you know I hate typing those things, right? They keep changing the format of them, and they've got all those lambda expressions. And so I'm going to select these private data elements, and I'm going to click this light bulb. And I'm going to generate my encapsulate field stuff and say, but still use field, because I like having my separate private data elements. And then I'm going to move my region and end region statements because they got separated. And I'm going to let Visual Studio generate those getters and setters for me. that work for everybody? Did you find it? Generate that code.
Did you right click on the private rule, positive, negative, to bring that up?
I selected them and then clicked on this light bulb, this quick action. And this is where if that one thing that was installed that I hate so much, I've totally forgotten its name, it'll change this a little bit. So we want to encapsulate field, but still use field.
What if you don't get the light bulb? We're not getting it down here.
Are you getting that other weird thing from the IntelliJ product?
It's just,
How about this wrench? You get nothing?
You have
You're-
to highlight the squiggle. Or you not, like highlight the whole thing, but hover over the squiggle underneath like notes or something, and it'll pop up.
What's squiggle?
So whenever you, it's green or red,
Uh-huh.
if there's an error or, warning, if you hover over it, it'll pop up.
except mine just gives me maybe.
Here, let me stop the share. Okay, share with us and show us what yours is doing.
Oh, yeah. Mine just shows how to fix it. It doesn't show. Right, it literally will do. Right.
Oh, nobody can see it. Hang on.
Yeah, let me fix mine. It's not holding.
Okay, now you can see it.
So see where, because I haven't done it yet, if you highlight the whole thing,
Uh-huh.
and then you just hover over notes, it'll pop up right here.
But that'll give you how to fix it.
Yeah.
Not how to add whatever.
Yeah, because you want it to be over there in the, so highlight them again and go over to the side. Okay, do you see that other, what's that? Click it.
It's a paintbrush. Yeah.
And then,
So this is the same thing we're all seeing back here, just to give you.
format selection. Go to the surround with. Yeah. Yeah. Now you're doing all that. It's that special helpful tool. Here, I'll just let you see it so you can type it in. Thank you. We'll just get it entered in real fast because it's not too much code, just these 3 lines of weird stuff. Now, while everybody's getting that typed in, the Lambda expressions, don't forget in their car class that they demo in the textbook, they have a couple of constructors that just only use that Lambda expression to indicate the one line of code that's in that constructor method. It can kind of look weird. So make sure when you look at that car class, you can figure out what's going on in every line of code in that class, because there's only about 12 lines of code in it, but every single one of them kind of uses an unusual feature. They try to make sure that every line of code uses something unusual. So remember, our Lambda expressions allow us to eliminate curly braces if we only have one line of code for a method, whether that method is a getter or a setter or a constructor or whatever type of method.
I really appreciate the synopsis that you just gave, because I haven't read anything that clear cut explaining Lambda, all kinds of different ways to define it, but that was.
I don't mind sounding dumb.
I really appreciate that.
I really like to simplify things, which sometimes is dumb, but that's all they are, right? Because I've read a bunch of those expressions. And it took me a really long time, and I try to stay away from them because the explanations were so involved. And
I've been trying to make a rule in my head that I could follow, and when I read stuff, I get 3 sentences in, and I'm like, I just.
yeah, the Lambda expression.
Keeps trying to.
It's so bad.
Yeah, they go in the Java text does an even worse job of explaining what Lambda expressions are. So I always have to stop and look at them because it's just different. Okay, so we need some constructors here in our class. We've got some private data elements, some public properties, we added in our override on our intake notes because we know for sure we have to have that. But now we need some constructors. So I'm going to add in a region statement for that. Constructors. So we could do a default no-R constructor. Now, we won't be able to test this today, just like you won't be able to test the classes necessarily that you turn in Wednesday because we don't have a tester. We're just creating these classes. And at this point, our goal is to get them to compile. So we could still have problems with them. We could have logic errors or some sort of other issue with them. That's a possibility because we haven't been able to test them. And that really is hard for some people. Some students feel like they're going to get in trouble or something. But as long as it's a valid class, bless you, that's what we should have at this point. Because there are points in your development effort where you haven't been able to test yet. And that's where we are with this one. Okay, so if I have a default no-R constructor, I can leave it like that. But then, bless you, what if I have just that patient name and admit date like I had before for my patient class? Let's simulate that. So I'm going to say that I have a string that is the name and I have a date time that is the admit date. And that's the only thing that I have for this. Now, immediately it's giving me errors. It's good. And it's saying that I need to have a body. Let me add that. Now it's all happy. Everything looks good. But I have one problem. Whoops, sorry about that. Deafening you. There's a few different ways I can do things, and we'll be able to look at the debugger once we've got our tester going and we can actually run some tests on this and see how this information gets passed back and forth. But let's Google it. C# base class parameters. So both of those parameters are things that need to go to the base class. Well, here's a good Stack Overflow one. It says that I have my parameter list, and then after my closing parenthesis, I use this :base keyword. So I'm going to put that in, :base, and then I list the parameters that go to the base class. And in this case, it's both of them. So the system, when we go to instantiate a COVID patient and we use this constructor, it's going to say, oh, both of these parameters are information that should be passed to the base class. We're going to go ahead and instantiate an instance of the base class of the patient behind the scenes. We can't do it, but the system can. So that base class is sitting in memory, and then we're going to come extend it, adding in the information for our COVID patient. And our information that we wanted to add is the positive, negative flag. So let's say we're going to say that they're negative by default. The date tested. And we can say that is date time dot now. Use the current date and current time. And then as far as our notes, we could just leave those empty at this point, or we could add something to it if we wanted to. Do you want to add in something like we could say patient is false as of date tested? And I'll put my $sign in front of my string to make it an interpolated string so that I can use that data. So when this constructor gets used, NA and AD, the data items will be passed to our patient class to instantiate the patient. Execution will continue returning to this constructor where it will set the defaults for its data items, and then we'll be done.
So my question is, the example that I've seen, I guess out of the other book, is all of the parameters. So positive, negative, date tested, nodes could all be part of the parameters for that constructor. Is that not necessary?
Let's do that. We can make a constructor like that too. We want to have several.
But I mean, so the information that we've got in the curly braces, would that not be necessary to put as parameters?
Let's think about it. Let's say that we're going to pass in that, and then we're going to also pass in the positive, negative. Oops, that's a Boolean. So this first parameter list, I have to have my data type.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
So in this constructor, we're saying that in addition to the patient's name and the admit date, we're also going to be expecting parameters of what their positive, negative status is, their admit date time, or their tested date, I guess, and then their nodes. So for this example, the base class still only wants NA and AD as its parameters, but now we have data for all of these other data items that were passed to us. So if we wanted to make one giant constructor that had all of the parameters for our base class and all of the parameters for our extended class, we could. We would just, in our base parameter list, include all of the parameters that go back to our base class. And they do have to all be in the same order. So remember, just like when we create a method, our parameter list has to be in the same order when we call that method. That's how constructors are. Our parameter list really needs to be in the same order unless we're using that name equal way of handling it. Okay, we're out of time. So for Wednesday's assignment, for the stuff that's due, you're going to create three classes. Your base class, that's your sports team, and then 2 extended classes like soccer and cheerleading, or football and baseball, or whatever your 2 sports are that you can think of, things that you need additional data for. So for soccer, we might want to have, I don't know, one thing that soccer players always mention is like how many fields are available or something. They have trouble scheduling fields. And so there are certain things like that for soccer teams that are really important. For cheerleading, we might have, something about like an assistant coach or somebody that takes care of uniforms. There could be all sorts of different data items that you need for the different types of sports. So remember, what you turned in for your assignment Wednesday or Tuesday, when is that due? Wednesday at midnight, right? Let's double check. That's why I'm checking this. Yeah, I'll change that to, well, what do you guys think? Let's do it by 8, And then that way, if you have any questions or anything to ask each other, you can, because I don't want it hanging on after class, because I think we're better off if you've got it done and you think you're ready to turn it in. And then, of course, you can update it a little bit in CFS if you need to, because that's separate from CFS. And you're all smart and know that, so it's not really a big deal. But you can still.
10.
Huh?
So should we do 10s instead of the class?
Sure, I'll do 10. That'd be good. And it's just your Canvas submission that it's going to be looking at anyways. So just be thinking about it. You're going to get them turned in for Wednesday, but that doesn't mean you can't change them. You know, that doesn't mean you can't change them as you decide for the coming week's assignments that you want to. And what is the coming week's assignment? A tester. Because how are we going to use these classes if we don't test them? So we'll be creating our tester for that. So we'll talk about that more Wednesday. So Wednesday, we'll create our tester for our patient stuff that we've been working on and see how we can get that part going. Questions?
Are you gonna put in Zoom on our probably so we can like practice at home?
I will.
Thank you.
No problem. I'm going to stop it now. Any questions out there in Zoom land? They've got it. All right.